and welcome to October's tea break, particularly after a couple of months break, the combination of summer and various other kind of things getting in the way. So great to see lots of people coming back despite the slight hiatus. And hopefully what we've got for you today will be particularly useful. That's the ambition at least. So as I say, we'll just take another minute or so just because we know there's more coming. And okay, how are we doing? My little bar has disappeared that tells me how we're doing. Great. Well, let's maybe start to do introductions, and then anyone that's joining in will at least hear what we've got to say, if not necessarily know who we are. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and I'm audio description or description time. So I'm a white male with a black t-shirt on in a sort of blurred, fairly plain room. And I'm joined by my colleague, Ben, who's one of our senior consultants. And Ben, do you want to do a quick hello and intro?
Hello, I'm not sure if my video is up, but I'm also a white male with a black v-neck, a white shirt, very boringly now I think about it, but new glasses.
New glasses, lovely. Okay. So I hope you've all got your cups of tea or other condiments, drinks of choice, etc. Ready. So let's dive into talking about what's driving or what we think is behind the changes in engagement by different audience groups at the moment. Just a quick check, Ben, you can still see my slides, can't you? Or everyone can still see my slides.
Yes, they're up.
Lovely. I just couldn't see a little ring around them, so I was just making sure. So, just by way of introduction, say I'll be talking during this in the language of audience spectrum. There's lots of different ways we can look at the data that we've got about people's changing behaviours, but there seem to be some really rich, interesting patterns here, and we haven't got huge amounts of time, so I thought let's focus on one particular dimension. As usual, there's lots of stuff that varies by age, by social group, by occupation type, etc. And we will publish more based on these findings in the coming weeks. Most of what I'm talking about today is based on the latest wave of the Cultural Participation Monitor. So it's a sample of about 2,500 nationally representative people from across the country. So a whole range of ages, ethnicities, audience spectrum types, regions, nations. So designed to give us sort of like a nice balanced quota of the whole population. I will occasionally also be referring to some sales data that we've got from Audience Answers, and that's based on 255 organisations where we've got consistent data for 5 years across all of those organisations. Again, that's a really broad national spread, different art forms, different scales, different places. But that gives us an idea of what's happening, if you like, through the venue box office. The survey information gives us information about the overall population and what's going on with them. And that's what we're going to focus on. So we're using Audience Spectrum. If you're not someone who isn't familiar with Audience Spectrum, you might want to take a screen grab of what you're seeing in front of you and keep that to hand, or refer to the Audience Spectrum bit of the Audience Agency website. I'll mention a few specific things about individual segments as we talk about them. But essentially, we've got 10 different groups of people that cover the whole population, who are higher, medium, or lower engaged and have different combinations of cultural behaviour, interests, barriers, motivations, and so forth. And we've been tracking how these different groups have been changing and responding to engaging over the last few years. And there have been some notable differences. And the thing that we've always found a little bit tricky is that we could see what was going on, but we didn't have that much information on why it was happening. So we were looking at things like attitudes to COVID, attitudes to the cost of living, but we hadn't necessarily had all the information about what else might be driving these changes in people's behaviour. So we've added some extra questions in the Cultural Participation Monitor this last time about some things that may or may not be changing in people's lives. And so we think we can draw some interesting lines between that and what's actually happening in terms of whether they're then going to arts and culture or not. So let's have a look. So just to start with a little bit of context, so we're talking about what's driving the change. I guess we need to say what the change is. Some of you may have seen a version of this graph, which is looking at this is the ticket sales stuff I was talking about, where we see the relative change in the number of tickets sold for each different type of audience spectrum segment, relative to what the levels were in 2018-19. So for any given segment, whatever their number was in 2018-19, we call it 100, and then we look at what the number is year by year after that. It obviously dropped during the pandemic, it came back, and on average, and in most cases, it didn't quite get back to the levels it was at in 2022-23, and since then it's basically flatlined. So that's the big headline story, is that the recovery kind of stalled for a year, and clearly that's linked to the cost of living. We can see, though, there's quite a big variety by different types of people. Those higher, medium, and lower engaged groups are color-coded here. So the higher engaged groups are the red ones, which are, broadly speaking, in many cases clustered around the average. Some of the groups, like frontline families, trips and treats, have come back in higher numbers than they were previously. Some of the groups, like home and heritage, supported communities, have come back in much lower numbers than previously. Broadly speaking, those are kind of middle and low engaged family groups and middle and low engaged older groups. There's more to say about them, but that's kind of as a headline. So that was the overall picture we saw, but let's zoom in a shorter time period and just look at this bit. This is just the last 2 years. How's that changed? And we've got this sales data on that, which is basically going to expand what we've got here on this chart. But we've also got survey data where we've asked people in the September participation monitor, are you attending more or less than you did 12 months ago, or about the same? And so we can take those figures and we can take the number of people that said they're attending more and subtract the number of people who said they're attending less. And so we get the kind of, on average, or the net amount, are they attending more or less, as I say. And if we put those two against each other, we get a nice pretty picture like this. Now, these bubbles are scaled by how many people said they're interested in arts and culture, but essentially the key thing is, where are these dots on these two axes? So we've got the sales data we were just looking at with the same index. So 100 would be the same in 2023-24 as it was in 2022-23. So quite a few of them are quite similar to that line. If it's to the right of that, it means that they're selling, or they're buying more tickets than they previously were. To the left of that line, they're buying fewer tickets. And similarly, on the survey data, how many more people or fewer people said they were attending more relative to less? So, for example, Metroculturals, top right, MC, there were 20% more people who said they were attending more than were saying they were attending less. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say 40% of people said they're attending more, 20% said they're attending less. So the difference is about 20%. So that's how that's calculated. And something of a relief, these two are quite closely linked. So what people are telling us in the survey is matching what we're seeing on the sales data. That by and large, if we're seeing more sales from people, they're telling us they're attending more. So that's kind of reassuring. What we are seeing in terms of overall picture is Metroculturals, who are the kind of super engaged, often heavily metropolitan concentrated, so particularly London, some Edinburgh, some Manchester, etc., but lots in London. They are attending more than they were last year. They're a relatively smaller group in terms of sales, in terms of the arts, but they're really big for London organisations. They are attending more. They say they're attending more. On the flip side, supported communities and home and heritage, particularly, but also up our street and dormitory dependables, are attending less than they were last year. And indeed, they're telling us they're attending less. So we're seeing those groups, which tends to be some of the older groups, not so much dormitory dependables, but the other three, some of the older groups, are attending less. So that's kind of an overall picture we've seen, but obviously if you've got different groups attending more or less in the population, that's going to have an impact on cultural organisations, but particularly those who have particular audiences. So if you're a London-based organisation that does sort of very sort of high-end contemporary art, or you're very high profile, etc., you may be catering for segments that are really, really sort of busy and popular. often, if you're trying to do work that is reaching people who are maybe less natural arts attendants in the first place, that's got even harder, is what this is showing. But crucially, we now have a bit more of a clue about what is driving that change in behaviour. So two things we have been looking at, which is worth kind of checking back in on, is about the influence of COVID and the influence of the cost of living, which of course have been a really big deal for everybody. Now, interestingly, and some people say this is an obvious thing to say, but COVID has not entirely gone away. And there remains about 20% of the population who say their cultural attendance, they are put off attending because of COVID. So about 20%, it varies by segment. And you can see here, if you look at the vertical scale, some groups, it's about 1 in 4 people who are saying, yes, it does actually influence whether I attend things. And it's particularly true for metroculturals and the typically lower engaged groups. On the other hand, some other groups, dormitory rentals, trips and treats, much less concerned about it. So levels much nearer sort of more 15%. Cost of living is higher for every group than COVID. So we started the axis at 40 because there was a big blank area otherwise. But essentially, it's more important for everybody, but it's particularly important for some groups relative to others. So the further right it is, the more concerned, or the more they say the cost of living impacts their engagement. Further left, the less impact it makes. So what we can see here, broadly speaking, is that all of the lower engaged groups are fairly well clustered. They're all really concerned by the cost of living. They all tend to be also less well off on average as well. But they're also relatively concerned by COVID. So they're kind of affected by both. And the usually middle engaged groups are a bit less concerned about both. But it's still substantial. It's still over half of people agreeing that they're put off attending by the cost of living, but it's not to the same extent. Where it gets interesting in terms of the difference is higher engaged groups, where we've got 2 that are relatively less concerned about COVID, retail and culture experience seekers. So traditional sort of commuter belt, relatively more traditional in their tastes maybe, but core kind of core arts audiences, particularly for their own more traditional art forms, and then experience seekers who tend to be sort of young, younger graduates or people even who are still studying, based on the edges of cities. So those 2 really key groups, less concerned by COVID, but experience seekers really worried about the cost of living, and the other 2 not so much because they're relatively more affluent. So we get a bit of a split in terms of how those factors are affecting us. And this is a variation of things that we've seen previously. Obviously, the cost of living is playing through in different ways at different times, but essentially that's the overall picture we're seeing. But we know that there are many other things going on that are affecting people's attendance. And this is where we get into the new bank of questions, which I'll start off by doing a little bit of explaining on, because they're just a little bit of clarifying what we're saying. So we asked people a whole series of different questions, and we said, here are 2 statements. Which of these statements do you agree with more? Statement A, statement B. And so here's an example of one of the statements. So statement A was, I'm more interested in going to arts and culture than I was 12 months ago, or I'm less interested in going to arts and culture than I was 12 months ago. And so people can say, well, I'm a lot more, I'm definitely a lot more A, or I'm a lot more B, or I'm somewhere in between, or slightly. And from that, we've added together all the ones that said they were more A, and subtracted the ones that said more B. So again, we get that kind of net figure. Are they this side of the line? Are they that side of the line in terms of these 2 statements overall as a segment? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So we asked that for a range of questions. The questions will vary, and for some questions, we essentially made sure that all the questions that made you more likely to attend were kind of one side of the line, and all the ones less likely to attend. So you could say, I have more people to go and visit events with, or I have fewer people, or I have fewer things I might do instead, or I've got more things I might do instead. So kind of, if you've got more other things to do, that can make you less likely to attend, so it gets counted as a negative. And this is what it looks like. And so this is this picture split out each segment. And so we've got, are people more interested or less interested? They got more to do, fewer things to do, more people to go with, less people to go with. Some really obvious ones: they have more time, more money, better health, or less of all of those. Then we ask, are there other changes that have made it easier to attend, or have there been other changes in your life that made you more willing to attend? And we also ask people to specify what those were. And often those things overlap with some of the previous categories. So people said, actually, yes, the other changes, my health is better. But in other cases, there's a whole variety of things which kind of reflect the full richness and complexities of people's lives. So it could be, births, deaths, care responsibilities, new relationships, ends of relationships, leaving prison in one case, but a whole host of different things, so affecting whether people can attend more or less. So that's what we've got, and we've split it out by segment to say, for each segment, which of these appears to be more or less, is more true than the other in terms of being a factor. Now, we don't know for certain that this is why people are attending more or less, but we can see that this is what people say is going on in their lives. So, at a very headline level, across almost all the segments, people are being quite positive about being interested in arts and culture. So that's kind of like a headline good news. People are generally speaking quite interested, but we might think that's partly kind of people being quite agreeable answering a survey, maybe. But still, it's potentially got quite good news. And across the board, so that was the green bar. The blue bar, that goes down quite often. Everybody, to some or other extent, is saying they've got less money than they do. That probably isn't a great surprise given the cost of living crisis. It's much more pronounced for some segments than others. So particularly some of those lower engaged segments, but also quite a lot of the middle engaged segments, really quite strongly affected by having less money. But we can also see there's a bunch of segments where they feel like their health is worse. So supported communities down there at the bottom, up our street, bottom left, and indeed to some extent all of the middle engaged groups saying their health, on average is a bit worse than it was. On the flip side, metrocultural is very buoyant, saying their health is much better than it was. And experience seekers are very positive about that as well. So what we can see as we look across all of these different segments is that there's different things or different numbers of things going on for different groups. So metroculturals, most things are in the positive. So we saw that they're attending more. They were the top right in that previous chart, who are attending more than they were and saying they're attending more. And pretty much everything is a breeze at their back, kind of making them more likely to attend. They've got more money, they've got more people to go to stuff with, they're more interested, their health is better. Things in their life make it easier to attend, they want to attend more. So loads of stuff is kind of encouraging in that direction. And yes, they may feel they've got less money, but to a lesser extent than everybody else, they're kind of, relatively speaking, doing better. So there's loads of reasons for them to be attending more. It's not surprising we're seeing them in the top corner. The two we saw far bottom left have sort of got a version of the opposite of that issue. So we've got supported communities who are there in the blue group, so the right-hand side of the blue group, who basically all of these factors are pushing against them attending more, apart from the fact they've got more time. So that could well be that people are working less, or because their health is worse, they're maybe sort of not going out as much. They've got a lot less money. That various things in life are just stopping them attending. They've got fewer people to attend stuff with anyway, and they're probably a bit less interested. And there are other things they'd rather be doing anyway. So for a whole host of reasons, it's not surprising to see that group attending less. And bearing in mind, that's a group that was attending not very much in the first place. So really kind of big reduction there. And the other one, top right, home and heritage. So this is the group that we've seen the biggest proportionate drop in engagement. And we can see, again, there's a whole host of reasons that are driving that. It's less about health than the other group, although it's still significantly about health. A fair bit of it is about not having people to attend things with, which I think is quite an interesting thing to factor in. There's some stuff about it being a little bit less willing. So various life circumstances have made that bit harder. they're relatively actually quite affected by reductions in money. So that's worth bearing in mind for that group. But generally speaking, there's a lot of things that are driving that group to attend less. So again, maybe not surprising they're down in that area as well. Where we see some interesting differences, I think, is where we've got groups like commuter land culture buffs and dormitory dependables. So they're both groups that are probably better off than average. They tend to, were prepared to buy big ticket events. They, by sheer volume, are the two biggest groups in terms of cultural attendance. But they've got quite a different picture going on. So for commuter land culture buffs, you see that little red bar dropping down, which is suggesting that they've got lots of other things that they could do instead. So whereas traditionally we might have expected that group to be very, very highly motivated by arts attendance and other things maybe don't distract them as much compared to other segments, that's maybe less true now than it was. That might explain some of why they're dropping down as a group. But there aren't lots of huge other barriers. So yes, they're worse off, but after metroculturals, they're kind of least affected in that way. And lots of other things are actually, if anything, kind of contributing to being able to attend. So really, it's about the relative reduction in interest of that group. So that's kind of quite interesting to bear in mind. Dormitory dependables, on the other hand, who we had seen holding up pretty well, and they'd taken over as the single largest group because commuter land culture dipped a bit, and so they kind of overtook them. But as the cost of living crisis grinds on, they become relatively more impacted by financial pressures. Their health is not as good as it was. It's just a little bit harder to engage for a variety of reasons. And they're also facing the same thing where they've got lots of other things that they could like to do instead. And to some extent, that was always the true of that group. They were more likely to be occasional arts attenders than commuter land culture buffs. So there we see a bit of a difference. And obviously, if you're trying to address those differences, that means that for commuter land culture buffs, it's a slightly simpler or more focused task about sort of re-engaging and re-motivating that group. But some of the practical barriers maybe aren't as explicit, whereas dormitory dependence, there's a whole host of different things might be going on. Now we see similar things with frontline families and trips and treats. These are two groups that we had seen in the long-term trend had been engaging much more. So on that initial graph where it kind of spread out from this sort of 100 on the left-hand side, it sort of fanned out. Those are the two that sat right at the top. So in the long-term trend, they've actually attended more than they had previously. But they're both very vulnerable to the cost of living crisis. They often, they're more likely to have children in the family and various other sort of pressures. And for frontline families, it's all about the money. That's the thing that really sticks out for that group. For trips and treats, there's a whole load of other complex stuff going on as well. And finally, without going through all of them in detail, we can see experience seekers, super keen to attend. They've got loads of people around them. They've got things in their life which are making them want to attend more. Their health is doing fine. They've even got more time. Some people in that group were saying things like, well, I've just gone to university, and so now I've got more free time, and so forth. So lots of reasons why they can attend, but they're just really pinched by the cost of living. So that's the thing to focus on for that group, that it really is about. It really is about the money. So hopefully this shows that there are a range of different things going on for different groups within the population, that what you might want to do to engage different groups might be different as a result, and really just to unpack that it's not just a simple thing about it's the cost of living and it's equal for everybody, or seeing maybe that there are some things which might be different from what we expected. So commuter land culture buffs, maybe we would have assumed that health was more of a factor, or maybe it was about loss of social groups of people who coordinate trips and things. That's not the case so much for them, but it is the case for certain other groups. So it's worth bearing that in mind when you're thinking about how to encourage future attendance. And tried to distill all of that into a single view in terms of the COVID and cost of living information, the different factors information, with a rough color coded guide to say these ones look like they're relatively easier, better prospects right now in terms of increasing engagement. These one might be relatively harder because of all the reasons we've just seen unpacked there. So we'll share these slides and you can look at that bit in more detail in due course. But in essence, we've got really quite different combinations of factors. And also, as we think forwards, I'm sure Ben will say something about this, but as some of the cost of living environment changes a bit, it will change faster for some groups than others. And that could mean that suddenly the opportunities open up for some groups in a way they don't necessarily open up first for others as well. So one to keep an eye on as we go forward. So that's a run through of what we've seen there. There will be more that we'll publish to unpack it further, but that's a kind of first view of it. And I'll hand over to Ben. I'm poised to switch you back to a particular slide if you want to.
Hello, hope you can see me. Yeah, actually, I think if you can navigate back to slide 13, Ollie, with all the graphs, and that's probably mostly what I'll speak about. So I've been asked just to give my initial response, having seen those slides. My initial response, without oversimplifying, not great news. As Ollie was saying at the start, in ticket data we've seen sales recover, but then level off at, on average, roughly 10% below pre-pandemic levels. Obviously different for different segments, as we saw in that initial graph. And then from these surveys, some other areas of concern, still perhaps surprising for me, certainly levels of COVID concern across a lot of the segments. And the big takeaway, cost of living became, after the COVID concern, and remains the key factor in why people say they're attending less. But there are lots of other interesting reasons for lower attendance, less than attendance factors, especially for those key and sort of most populous, medium engaged, mustard yellow audience spectrum segments, dormitory dependables, trips and treats, and particularly home and heritage. But let's start with something positive. The green bars. When asked, every segment except supported communities say they are more interested. And you can argue that it'd be rude not to say that when asked that in a survey, and there's undoubtedly some sort of positivity bias in questionnaires, but this is significantly up, and it's interesting to see how it's relatively up across different segments. Metroculturals are over 40% more interested, and experience seekers nearly 30% more interested, and all the high and mid-engaged sort of pinky, salmony pink and yellow segments, where most of our engagement comes from across the culture sector, are up well over 10%. This is good. We are relevant to people. If these were down, we'd be in real trouble. We are relevant to people. We're more in people's minds. So let's hold on to the green bar love as I dive into some of the perhaps more challenging takeaways that I took. Interestingly, 4 groups also now having new and different people to go with as an increase factor. Metroculturals and experience seekers, and to a lesser extent, commuter and culture buffs and dormitory dependables. And that adds a positive sort of social driver to going out, as we perhaps post-pandemic, I don't know. But the unmissable key final finding, going away from the positivity now, is that purple bar of everyone feeling the pinch, to notably different degrees, but everyone feeling it. So what does this mean? What do we do about it? Well, what the data tells us from the box office is that it depends on your audience makeup. So first thing is look at your audience makeup from your surveys or ticketing data on audience answers. If you're not an audience answer, you can still go to audience answers and look at your area and see who lives around you. There's free maps on there to do that. And that will give you an overview. And there's obviously more detail available through things like area profile reports, population profile reports, so you can get a detailed look at who's in your area. What are the segments in your audience and your catchment? Because depending on that, it will have a different impact on you. At the extremes, if you have a largely metrocultural audience, then you are, well, probably in London, but to some extent Edinburgh and Manchester. But there's, clear, it's all positive here, lots of up bars. There's clear growth potential, lots of interest, more time, more social connections. These people are going out, and arts is high on the list. So the demand is there for you to convert. But they're not a massively populous group, and they're concentrated in small areas. So that's not good news for most. Conversely, if you're dependent on the home and heritage segment, you probably need some quite radical new approaches. This segment's engagement was slow to recover post-pandemic and remains the most depressed, and it feels like a sort of declining segment. You might be looking to expand your appeal if you're reliant on them. If your mission as your organization, your driver is to engage some of the most deprived segments, then supported communities really need your engagement and your help. They are more left out than ever before, it looks like. Arts engagement could clearly make a real difference at a difficult time for them, but you really are going to have to do the work more than ever to reach them with interest down, everything down except time. My, I guess, natural perspective in response to these insights comes from working in theatres most of my life, where the pressure to generate income for a ticketed arts organisation who was also sort of in a tight cost of living crisis and feeling the pinch, the funding pinch at the moment. For these organisations, on average, bread and butter tends to sit around the high to mid-engaged populist groups, community land culture buffs, dormitory dependables, experience seekers. Your audiences are feeling the pinch, especially experience seekers, like that downward purple bar, and they're looking for value. We need to resist the urge to just discount. If you have seat capacity, can you introduce savings attached to frequency, offering good value in return for more engagement? So can you engage that increased interest to encourage more frequent attendance? Things like multi-buy accumulators, as the more you buy them, the more you save as you go through the season. Can you combine that with the growing social circles in some of these groups to increase group size and potentially introduce new audiences as with people get people initiatives? Bring a friend and save, bottle of wine at the interval for groups of 4 or more, that sort of thing. So can we focus on those audiences where the opportunity is highest, which tends to be that orange, to see us through these difficult times by getting people to come more, or bring people with their increasing social engagement, desire for social activity in the arts. If you offer a free experience, for example, if you're a museum or a gallery, this is a good time to engage people who are more interested than ever before, according to the green bars, but cash poor. You have the perfect offer for the times. But remember, these people are also time poor. So messaging should be simple. It should point out what's special, and it should emphasize the social. You need a clear offer. You need moments to catch alongside collections, special exhibitions. You need convenient engagements, evening, lunchtime events, things, short duration offers. And emphasize events or visits to enjoy with other people, and reflect this in marketing materials, copy and images. And I think that simple, special social message holds true as a useful response for all of us, I think. So looking to the future, are these sustained trends? Well, our research obviously looks backwards, we don't know, but we know that cost of living, while not the only influence on attendance, as this research demonstrates, has undoubtedly been a huge drag on attendance and indeed donation and other income sources. Today's inflation figures and predictions of interest rate drops suggest that the squeezed middle may start to feel less squeezed. Wages have been higher than CPI inflation for every year now, and there is a lag in feeling that across the population, but the best guess is that those purple bars will get shorter or start going up even. So for those earning their core income from audiences, if you can make it across this current dangerous mountain pass where things are looking quite bad, then there are, if not sunlit uplands, at least signs of greener fields ahead. That recovery will be faster for some than others. So you've got to think about that, as Ollie said. I think that's probably my initial thoughts. We should move, see if there's time for a few questions. Is there anything in the chat?
Questions or indeed other people's thoughts and reflections based on what we've said as well. So if there's particular things that you've thought based on what we've shared, so please do. Oh, there we are. I've gone too far. So there's some of the resources that Ben was talking about that are available to sort of unpack some of this more, and this will be available on these slides when we share them.